5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear, and tonight we're going to talk about giants. Before we talk about giants as creatures, we have to talk about memory. Not personal memory, not stories your grandparents told you. I mean cultural memory. The kind that survives floods, wars, migration, religious rewrites, and the slow grinding down of history. By people who want things neat and explainable. Giants don't show up once or twice and disappear. They show up everywhere, on every continent, in cultures that never met, in places separated by oceans, centuries, and languages that had no business agreeing on anything, except this one detail. There were beings that were larger than us, stronger than us. They were also physically, visibly unavoidable. Every ancient culture has its first people. And in a shocking number of cases, those first people were not human-sized. The Bible calls them Nephilim, not poetic, not symbolic, but described as mighty ones, men of renown, born when something unnatural crossed a boundary that was not supposed to be crossed. The Greeks called them Titans, beings so large and powerful that even the gods feared them and had to overthrow them rather than coexist with them. The Norse spoke of the Jotnar, the frost giants, who weren't fairy tale villains, right? But ancient forces of the land itself, older than the gods, tied to mountains, glaciers, and the brutal indifference of nature. Native American tribes across North America told stories of cannibal giants, red-haired giants, stone giants, forest giants, beings that hunted humans the way humans hunt animals and had to be driven out, trapped, burned, or buried under landslides. And one good story that I've heard Native Americans is in Lovelock, Nevada, in the Lovelock Caves. If you go look at it, they call them Skinwalker Caves, and you can actually see the burn marks where the natives trapped a group of giants in there, and they set brush on fire, and it killed them, and then, look into that. And what's important here is that these stories don't feel like entertainment. They feel like warnings. They're told with the same tone if you were explaining why you don't go near a certain river bend, or why no one camps in a particular valley. There's fear in them, yes, but there's also instruction. They exist at the edge of where people are allowed to go. And here's where things get uncomfortable for modern ears. Ancient people were not stupid. They didn't lack imagination, but they also didn't waste it, carving stone tools, tracking seasons, reading weather, surviving famine. These are not the habits of people who casually invent massive humanoids for fun. When early humans describe something as enormous, they usually mean it literally. When they said something lived in the mountains or the forest or beyond the settled land, they were describing territory that was actively dangerous, not symbolic. Giants didn't live in the village. They lived where humans didn't belong. And then there were the bones. Almost in every culture that tells giant stories also tells stories about finding remains. Massive bones pulled from the earth, skulls too large to be human, femurs longer than a grown man is tall. In the ancient world, there was no distinction between archaeology and myth. You found something in the ground, you explained it with the best framework you had, and over again, that framework was giants. Not dragons, not demons, giants. Human-shaped, upright, familiar enough to be recognized, wrong enough to fear. So let's fast forward to the modern era real quick. And something strange happened. As science becomes organized, professionalized, and institutional, giant bones don't stop appearing. But the explanation change. They're reclassified. Mammoths, mastodons, megafauna, anything but something that looks too much like us. Because here's the quiet truth no one likes to say out loud. A giant that looks like a human breaks more rules than a giant lizard ever could. It forces questions about our own origins, about coexistence, about dominance, about whether we were ever truly alone at the top of the food chain. Now, let's slow this down. I know we've been going pretty fast, but let's look at the geography of where these giants are actually at. So, giants almost always associated with specific landscapes: mountains, high plains, deep forests, deserts, and places where sound travels strangely. They're tied to elevation and isolation. The Andes, the Caucasus, the Appalachians, the Rockies, the Scottish Highlands, the American Southwest. These aren't random backdrops. They are places where scale messes with perception, where weather hides things, where distance lies to your eyes, where something can watch you long before you ever notice it. And almost every giant tradition includes the same detail at some point. Contact stopped, the giants withdrew, they were driven off, they died out, they retreated underground, they left this world. The reasons changed depending on the culture: wars with the gods, divine punishment, human resistance, starvation, but the outcome is always the same. Giants no longer walk openly among us. Openly, right? Remember that word because it's very important. Because the stories don't end with extinction, they end with absence, with silence, with a sense that something stepped back, not vanished, like a fire that burned too bright and then went underground, smoldering where you can't see it, but you can still feel the heat. And this is where we like to live on Highway of the Hidden, because modern giant encounters don't come wrapped in mythology. They come wrapped in confusion, in shaky footage, and people apologizing before they speak, and witnesses who say, "I know how this sounds," before they ever describe what they saw. They come from hunters, construction workers, hikers, truck drivers, people who spend long hours in big empty places and have no incentive to lie. People who aren't looking for monsters and definitely aren't looking to become the kind of person everyone side eyes at the diner. Before we get there, before the modern sightings, before videos, before whispers about why these encounters seem to be increasing, we have to understand something fundamental here. Giants don't behave like cryptids that want attention. They don't stalk suburbs, they don't play to crowds, they don't haunt tourist towns. They keep distance, they avoid structures, they move with purpose, not curiosity. And most importantly, they don't want to be seen, which raises a question that sits heavy once you really think about it. That question is this: if giants were never myths, if they were never extinct, if they simply learned a very long time ago that being noticed gets you hunted, then what we're dealing with now isn't the return of the giants, it's the thinning of the veil that kept them hidden. And that's where this road starts to get dangerous. So I'm assuming the question being asked that I want to ask, right, is if giants still exist, and that's the assumption we're working from, then the first mistake people make is imagining them as oversized humans wandering around aimlessly. Because that's not how the stories describe them, ancient or modern. Giants don't behave like animals, and they don't behave like people. They behave like something that has survived us. Because anytime we hear something, we want to hunt it down and get rid of it. So survival, that has to leave patterns. Across cultures, across centuries, giants follow rules, not laws written down. Rules learned the hard way. Rule that separate what lives from what gets erased. And when you line the old accounts up beside modern encounters, something unsettling happens. The rules haven't changed. The first rule is territory. Giants do not roam, they occupy. Every account that holds weight places them in specific zones: valleys that never get settled, ridgelines people avoid without knowing why, forests where trails abruptly stop, deserts where sound feels swallowed instead of echoed. These places develop reputations long before anyone has seen anything. Hunters talk about them, surveyors mark them and move on, construction projects stall, roads detour for some reason that never quite make it into public reports. And people, they feel watched there. Not in a jump scare way, but in a steady, patient way, like something has already noticed you and deciding whether you matter. The second rule is distance, and giants do not rush. They don't charge because they don't need to. Most encounters describe the same moment of delayed terror: the realization that what you're looking at is far away and still impossibly large, standing upright, moving smoothly, covering ground without effort. Witnesses often say the same thing without realizing it's a pattern. If it wanted me, I wouldn't have the time to react. That's not a thought you have when you see a bear. That's not a thought you have when you see a moose. That's a thought you have when you recognize dominance. The third rule is silence. Giants are quiet in a way that feels wrong. Not just they don't make any noise, but the environment itself seems to dampen around them. Birds stop. Insects fade out. Wind drops. Modern witnesses describe forests going flat, like someone hit mute on the world. Ancient stories describe the same thing using different language: the land holding its breath, the mountain listening, the air growing heavy. This isn't accidental. Large animals make noise. A creature that large should be clumsy. It should snap branches, crack rock, announce itself, but giants don't, which suggests intention, awareness, and control. And control is intelligence fingerprint. The fourth rule is avoidance of proof. And this is where the skeptics usually jump in, because they think no body, no evidence means no creature. But that only works if the creature is careless. Giants are not. They don't leave remains where people can recover them. They don't die in accessible places. And when something is found, a footprint too large to explain, a structure too big to be ceremonial, a tool scaled wrong for humans, it's isolated, inconvenient, incomplete, just enough to be unsettling, never enough to be definite. Ancient giants were said to bury their dead deep. Some traditions say they burned them. Others say they took them into mountains and sealed the entrances. Modern encounters reflect the same thing. Sightings without follow-up, tracks that vanish at rock faces, trails that end where climbing becomes impossible. And then there's the most important rule of all. Giants do not interact unless something has gone wrong. Every meaningful encounter, ancient or modern, happens after violation. Someone enters a forbidden area, someone hunts where they shouldn't, someone builds where the land doesn't want to be cut open, someone lingers too long, someone ignores warnings they don't understand. In Native American traditions, this is explicit. Giants are not monsters, they are punishments. Consequences made flesh. They appear when balance breaks, when humans overstep, when greed, arrogance, or carelessness push too far into places that were never meant to be domesticated. And that's where modern stories start to sound eerily familiar. And hunters describe seeing something massive step into the tree line after firing a shot. Hikers report being shadowed after crossing into restricted areas. Construction crews talk about equipment failures, missing tools, and workers refusing to return to sites without being able to explain why. Long-haul truckers tell stories about silhouettes pacing their rigs along ridgelines at impossible speed, only visible when lightning flashes or headlights catch moving where nothing should be. These people don't say, "I saw a giant." No, they say, "I saw something that shouldn't have existed." And then they usually just be quiet about it and go on about their day. Because there's a psychological cost to seeing something that big, something that doesn't acknowledge you, something that treats you like a background noise instead of prey. Witnesses often report delayed reactions, no screaming, no running, no panic until hours later. The brain doesn't know where to put the experience. There's no category for it, so it files it under silence. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Giants don't need secrecy. We give it to them. We give it to them without even knowing it. Every time a witness stay quiet to avoid ridicule, every time footage gets dismissed as scale illusion, every time someone convinces themselves it was just a trick of the light, that's camouflage more effective than fur or shadow. And if giants have been watching us for thousands of years, watching us invent weapons, roads, satellites, drones, then adapting wouldn't be optional. It would be survival. They wouldn't fight us head on. They wouldn't announce themselves. They would learn our blind spots, our assumptions, our arrogance. They would learn that humans don't see what they don't expect to see. And that's the most dangerous rule of all, because it means giants don't need to hide everywhere. They only need to hide well enough. And that's exactly where we're going, into modern encounters that break these rules just enough to let something slip through. Not myths, not legends, but moments. Moments where the distance closed, where the silence failed, where someone realized too late they weren't alone in a place that had never belonged to them. And once you hear those accounts, you start to understand something chilling. Giants don't come looking for us. We keep wandering into them. So with that being said, there's a point in every genuine giant encounter where fear changes shape. It doesn't explode, it doesn't scream, it sinks. People expect terror to be loud, panic, adrenaline, running without thinking, but the fear that comes with giants is quieter than that, heavier. It feels like gravity increasing around your thoughts, like your body understands something your mind isn't ready to accept yet. And usually that's you are not the biggest thing here, and that you never were, and whatever is has noticed you long before you noticed it. Modern encounters almost always begin the same way. Wrongness, not visual, environment. The forest feels staged, right? Like a movie set after the crew has left. Sound thins out, wind drops, even insects seem to step back. People describe the sensation of being out of time like the world has slipped into an older model where humans don't matter as much. And then comes the scale. Witnesses rarely describe faces first. They describe height, shoulders clearing treetops, a silhouette that doesn't fit between landmarks the way it should, something upright, moving behind a ridge that should have hidden it. but it doesn't. And there's always a pause, a few seconds where the brain desperately searches for a safe explanation, a tower, machinery, a trick of distance, and then it moves. Not fast, not slow, but purposeful. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when the fear becomes physical. People report pressure in their chest, legs that feel unreliable, a strange urge to stay still, not because they're frozen, but because something deep and ancient is telling them movement would be a mistake. This isn't prey panic, it's submission response. The same instinct animals show when they recognize a predator that doesn't need to chase. Some witnesses hear breathing, not loud, not monstrous, just deep, steady, controlled. Others report footsteps that don't land like impacts, but like weight being placed, as if whatever this is knows exactly how much force the ground can tolerate without announcing its presence. And then there's the eye contact. When it happens, and it doesn't always, it changes people. Eyes aren't described as glowing. That's Hollywood. They're described as aware, focused, measuring. Witnesses say the look feels ancient but not stupid, curious but not interested, like being examined briefly and then dismissed. The worst encounters are the ones where the giants don't acknowledge the person at all, because that means you weren't a threat, you weren't prey, you were just scenery. Some encounters end with retreat. The giant steps back into cover, moves down slope, blends into terrain in a way that should be impossible for something that large, and people don't chase, they don't film, they don't shout, they leave quietly, like someone backing out of a room where they've interrupted something that shouldn't have been seen. There are stories, modern ones, where distance collapses. Hunters who realize the tree line they thought was empty has been pacing them for miles. Campers who wake up to footsteps circling their sight without ever breaking brush. Workers who feel vibrations through heavy equipment before anything becomes visible. People who suddenly understand that the reason nothing attacked them is because they were being escorted out. And then there are the disappearances. Not dramatic, not bloody, just absences. Trails where people vanish without signs of struggles. Remote work sites where someone walks out of view and never comes back. Mountains that keep their dead without returning evidence. Official explanations pile up: fall, exposure, animals. But the patterns don't always fit. Some cultures never believed giants hunted humans casually. They believed the giants took them, whether it was for food or punishment or removal. And once you allow that thought to exist, even briefly, the world starts to rearrange itself. Suddenly, the fear ancient people felt makes sense. Suddenly, the obsession with boundaries, warnings, taboos, and forbidden places doesn't sound primitive, it sounds practical. Giants don't need numbers. They don't need territory expansion. They don't need dominance displays. They just need space. And of course, us as humans are very bad at respecting space. We like to build roads where we shouldn't, drill where we're warned not to, push into valleys, ridges, and forests because maps say they're empty. But empty doesn't mean unoccupied, it just means quiet. And here's the darkest part, the part most people avoid because it doesn't feel good to sit with. Giants may not hate us, right? They may just simply outlast us. Think about it. A species that learned early not to overhunt, not to overexpose, not to fight wars it didn't need to win. A species that learned humans burn bright, expand fast, and collapse often. All they would need to do is wait, stay hidden, and let us extinct ourselves. And occasionally, when rules are broken, remind us we're not alone. That reminder doesn't come with speeches. It doesn't come with explanation. It comes with scales and with silence. Also, with the unmistakable knowledge that something much larger than you is choosing in that moment not to interfere. And once you've felt that, once you've stood in a place where the land itself seemed to side with something else, you don't come back unchanged. You walk quieter, you listen longer, you leave places sooner than planned. Because deep down, whether you say it out loud or not, you understand something our ancestors never forgot. There are things on this planet that don't need us, and some of them are still standing exactly where they've always been and waiting, which is actually quite terrifying if you ask me. But now we're going to get into a very well-known giant story, the Giant of Kandahar, that they say that refuse to stay buried no matter how hard institutions try to sit on them. The Giants of Kandahar is one of those stories. It doesn't come from ancient text or oral tradition passed down around fires. No, it comes from soldiers, from a combat zone, from a place where everything is documented, logged, time-stamped, and where imagination is a liability, not a luxury. So this story surfaces from Afghanistan early 2000s during military operations in the Kandahar region. rugged terrain, caves everywhere, mountains that don't care who claims them, the kind of land that swallows sound, and people with equal indifference. So, according to the accounts, and what matters here is how consistent they are, a U.S. Special Forces unit was dispatched to investigate while patrols were going missing in a remote mountainous area. No bodies, no firefights, just sudden loss of contact, men gone without noise, without distress calls, without evidence of engagement. That alone is enough to raise alarms. So when the unit arrived in the area, they reportedly found equipment, standard issued military gear, scattered near a cave system. Weapons damaged, comms destroyed, blood present, but not in a way that suggested a normal ambush, not bullet casings, not blast marks, something closer to impact. And then the cave opened. What emerged is described the same way across multiple retellings, even when the storytellers don't know each other. A humanoid figure, approximately 12 to 15 foot tall, massive shoulders, long arms, red or auburn hair, a beard, primitive clothing or wrappings, and a spear. And not a fancy spear, not ceremonial, a functional weapon scaled to something that could throw it like a javelin. So the thing didn't posture, it didn't roar, it charged. Soldiers fired repeatedly, small arms supposedly ineffective at first. The creature closed distance faster than something that size should have been able to. One soldier was reportedly impaled, lifted off the ground, not dragged, not mauled, skewered. That detail matters. This is not normal animal behavior. That's tool use. That's intent. Eventually, sustained fire brought it down. Heavy caliber weapons, the kind used when something refuses to stop. The creature fell, and the silence afterward wasn't relief, it was shock. Because no one had words for what they were looking at. The body was examined briefly. Blood was described as dark and thick. The anatomy was wrong in subtle ways. Proportions off, muscle density extreme, bone structure heavier than human. And then, just like that, it was gone. Airlifted, classified, removed from the narrative. And the soldiers were told not to talk. And officially, nothing happened. Now here's where people usually dismiss this story. They say it's a campfire rumor, a barrack myth, something soldiers passed around to cope with stress. But that explanation doesn't hold up clearly. Combat veterans don't invent stories that make them sound afraid of something they couldn't control. They invent stories that make sense of chaos, not ones that introduce something worse than the enemy. And this story didn't spread like a joke, it spread like a warning. What makes the Giant of Kandahar especially disturbing is how neatly it fits the rules we've already talked about. Remote territory, cave system, disappearances, violation of space, a response only after humans pushed too far in. And notice something else. The giant wasn't hiding in folklore-heavy Europe or myth-saturated North America. It was a place where giant traditions already exist. Ancient Afghan legends of desert giants, mountain dwellers, red-haired cannibals being driven into caves by early people. Stories Western audiences never hear because they don't fit the narrative we're comfortable with. This wasn't a creature wandering aimlessly. No, it was guarding something, or claiming something, or enforcing something. And when armed humans entered its territory repeatedly, it responded. The most chilling part isn't the firefight, it's the aftermath. Because if this story is even partially true, which I believe it is, if something like that existed long enough to develop territory, behavior, and tool use, then killing it wasn't a victory, it was an escalation, a signal flare. And what that signal flare is, it means giants aren't just watching hikers and hunters in remote forests. It means they're aware of us at our most aggressive, at our most armed, at our most technologically advanced. And they still don't reveal themselves unless pushed, which raises a question no official report will ever touch. If that wasn't the only one, if that was just one territorial encounter, if there are others deeper in regions no one patrols anymore, then the Giant of Kandahar isn't proof of a monster, it's proof of restraint finally breaking. And restraint, once broken, doesn't always return, because whatever lived in that cave didn't survive by being stupid, it survived by being patient. And patient, when it ends, tends to end violently. So now that we talked about the Giants of Kandahar, I want to get into something that I believe truly happens. And that's the Smithsonian. And there's a moment in every forbidden subject where the creature stops being the problem and the system becomes a story. Up to this point, giants live in the margins, old legends, remote encounters, soldiers whispering about things they weren't trained to see. But once you start asking why these stories never cross a certain line into public acceptance, you run into the same name over and over again. Not shouted, not accused loudly, just present. The Smithsonian Institution. Now, officially, the Smithsonian is a guardian of history, a preserver, a collector, a natural authority tasked with protecting humanity's past. And for most things, that's exactly how it operates: fossils, tools, artifacts, bones, cataloged, classified, displayed. But giants? Giants, where the relationship fractures. For over a century, there have been recurring claims, not from fringe mystics, but from newspaper, amateur archaeologists, local historians, and early researchers, describing the discovery of unusually large human-like skeletons across North America, burial mounds in the Midwest, caves in Nevada, riverbanks in Wisconsin, ancient sites that predate recorded history. And then here's the detail that never goes away. In these stories, the remains are reported. They are documented locally. Photographs are sometimes taken, officials are contacted, and then representatives arrive, often described as from the Smithsonian or from Washington or from the federal government. And after that, the remains vanish, no public catalog, no permanent exhibit, no academic consensus, just silence. Now, skeptics will say this is a coincidence, exaggeration, or misidentification, and sometimes it may be true. Early archaeology was messy, records were incomplete, bones were often misread, but here's the problem with dismissing all of it that way. The pattern never stops. If you find something, they will come and take it from you. The same reports repeat across decades, across states, across unrelated communities, always involving oversized skeletons, always followed by removal, always followed by denial that such remains ever existed. And the Smithsonian has addressed this, sort of. Publicly, the institution denies ever suppressing evidence of giants. It clearly states that no verified giant skeletons exist in its collection, that any claims suggesting otherwise are hoaxes, misinterpretation, or outright fabrication. But that answer creates a deeper question. If the remains never existed, why did the stories of their removal exist at all? Why do early newspapers, from an era before viral hoaxes and internet clout, repeatedly report the same discovery using the same language? Why do so many accounts mention institutional involvement? Specifically, why do Native American oral histories, told long before the Smithsonian existed, describe giant remains being taken away by outsiders who did not want the stories remembered? And why does the topic provoke such an immediate shutdown? Because giants don't challenge biology, they challenge narrative. A confirmed giant human lineage doesn't just rewrite anthropology, it destabilizes it. It raises questions about coexistence, extinction, and the hierarchy. It forces a confrontation with the idea that modern humans were not an uncontested apex, that we may have shared this land with something larger, stronger, and harder to erase than we're comfortable admitting. Institutions are built on stability. History is curated to make sense. Outliners are dangerous. History is written by the winners, and the giants are the ultimate outliners. They are also a quieter angle most people miss. Museums don't preserve just the past, they decide what counts as the past. And anything that doesn't fit into the framework, anything that introduces some kind of unresolved of their narrative, gets labeled unreliable and quietly removed from serious discussion. Now, it's not always out of malice. Nope, sometimes it's out of necessity, because once a single giant is acknowledged, every legend, every modern encounter, every disappearance suddenly demands reevaluation. And that would send us into chaos if they came out tomorrow and said, yes, everything that you believe in exists. And that's the door institutions like that don't want to open. So instead, everything becomes folklore, you get labeled as crazy, things like that. And that kind of social pressure does more work than any locked archive ever could. And whether or not you believe the Smithsonian actively suppresses giants, evidence misses the larger point. Control doesn't require secrecy, it requires ridicule. It requires framing the subject so tightly that no serious person wants to touch it, so witnesses stay quiet, so researchers redirect their careers, so the public never demands answers because they've been trained to laugh at first. And that leaves us with a strangled kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, the silence of something that was decided out of existence, which brings us back to giants themselves. If they were real, which I think they are, then someone somewhere made a decision about humanity was allowed to remember. And if they still exist now, watching from places we rarely go, then maybe the cover-up isn't about protecting us from the truth, Maybe it's about protecting the story we tell ourselves about being alone at the top, because once that story collapses, so does our sense of control. And I believe the first thing you should notice when you line modern giant encounters up side by side is they don't feel accidental anymore. They don't feel like someone stumbled onto something rare. They feel like proximity. Most of modern reports don't come from people researching for answers. They come from people doing ordinary work in extraordinary places. Cutting timber, pouring concrete, surveying land, driving through the night, hunting to feed their families, people whose lives already exist at the edge of civilization, where the world still has room to breathe. And that's where the sightings start to cluster. Forestry workers talk about silhouettes standing just inside the tree line, not hiding, not advancing, just present. Too tall to be mistaken, too still to be human. Witnesses describe the same unsettling detail. Whatever it is doesn't flinch when machinery screams to life, chainsaws, loaders, excavators, sounds that send every animal running. But this thing, it stays. Not aggressive, not curious, just assessing the situation. And hunters have some of the most terrifying stories described being paralleled, not stalked, not chased, matched step for step along ridges they thought were empty. They'll stop, glass the terrain, see nothing, then move again and feel it immediately. That pressure, that awareness, the certainty that something is pacing them without effort. And when they finally see it, it's never rushing. It's already where it needs to be. And then the truckers, they see all kinds of stuff, and they tell the quieter stories. Ones they usually share only after someone else admits something first. Long stretches of highway, mountain passes, desert roads where headlights don't reach as far as they should. They talk about movement, keeping pace with their rigs on ridgelines, something upright, too tall, covering ground that fast vehicles struggle to handle. They glance away for a second time, and when they look back, it hasn't fallen behind, it's just adjusted. And then there's the footage, or rather, the almost footage. Phones come out late, shake, scale doesn't translate, and depth collapses. People record for a few seconds. And then stop, not because it vanished, but because the instinct to document loses a fight with the instinct to survive. What's captured is never enough, a shape, a stride, a moment where something crosses an opening that should have hidden it. And the comments always say the same thing: fake, perspective, it's just a guy, or it's AI. But witnesses, they don't argue back. They don't need to. They didn't just see something. They were evaluated by it, and that's the shift. And they don't have to argue back, because that's why Polar Bear's here, and Polar Bear will argue your case for you. But the earlier encounters, they follow the old rules: distance, silence, avoidance. But newer ones don't always end that way. No. In some cases, giants don't retreat when noticed. They don't break eye contact. They don't move away. They stay. And then you have the campers, the people that go out in the woods, like real deep in the woods. Campers report shapes standing beyond firelight for long stretches of time. Not circling, not closing in, just watching. Hours pass. Fire burns low. And then the thing never steps forward, never steps back. It waits until morning light thins into the shadow and then simply isn't there anymore. Construction crews, they report machinery malfunction, clustered around specific zones, tools misplaced, equipment turned slightly off alignment, the sense that something large moved through a space without damaging it, like someone passing carefully through a room full of fragile things. And then there are the encounters that don't leave room for doubt. Moments where distance collapses unexpectedly. A hiker crests a ridge and finds something already there, standing upright, facing away, close enough to hear breathing. A hunter turns and realizes the tree he leaned against isn't a tree at all. A worker feels vibration through steel before anything becomes visible. In those moments, fear doesn't spike, it empties. Witnesses describe an overwhelming certainty that running would be noticed, that noise would be corrected, that panic would be a mistake, and so they do the only thing that makes sense: they withdraw. Slowly, quietly, without breaking the unspoken agreement, and the thing lets go of them. That detail shows up again and again. Giants do not pursue unless challenged. Giants do not react unless provoked. Giants do not waste energy, which suggests something far more unsettling than aggression. It suggests restraint is still in place, but under strain, because the world has changed faster than it ever has. Roads cut deeper, forests thin out, mountains get mapped, scanned, flown over. Thermal imaging becomes casual. Drones fill the air. Satellites erase blind spots that once belonged to the shadows. And the giants that are still here, they're not stupid. They notice. They recognize patterns, they understand escalation, and they learn when hiding no longer guarantees safety. And some encounters feel less like accidental sightings, but more like tests. Moments where giants allow visibility, moments where distance is reduced intentionally, moments where humans are watching back, as if something is gauging response, not hostility, not fear, but behavior. Do we run? Do we film? Do we approach? Or do we respect the boundary? Because once a boundary is crossed enough times, it stops being a boundary at all, and then it becomes a challenge. And this is where ancient stories start to feel less symbolic and more poetic. Cultures didn't fear giants because they were big. They feared what happened when balance broke, and when territories shrank, and when rules stopped being honored. Giants weren't the danger, the transition was. A shift from avoidance to interaction, from distance to familiarity, from patience to necessity. If giants are still here, still watching us expand, consume, dig, map, and expose, then the most dangerous assumption we can make is that they will always step aside, because no species survives by retreating forever. And if the sightings are increasing, not because giants are returning, but because there's nowhere left to hide, then what we're witnessing now isn't discovery, it's compression. Space is running out, silence is thinning, distance is failing. And once something that large decides it can't afford to be invisible anymore, history suggests the reminder won't be gentle, because giants don't announce change, they embody it. There's a reason why these ancient stories about giants, only a few of them ever end with victory. And a lot of them just end with distance. They'll end with withdrawal, exile, sealing silence, mountains collapsing, valleys avoided, names no longer spoken out loud, because defeating something that big was never the point. Surviving it was. Remembering where it lived was. Teaching the next generation where not to go mattered more than explaining what it was. Somewhere along the way, we lost that instinct. Modern humanity is obsessed with illumination, with exposure, with dragging everything into the light and demanding it make sense on our terms. We don't leave blank spaces on maps anymore. We don't tolerate unknowns. If something doesn't fit, we reduce it, ridicule it, or bury it under enough noise that it stops asking to be understood. But giants don't just exist in noise. They exist in scale. And scale doesn't argue with you. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care what you believe. It simply is. You can deny it all the way up until the moment you're standing beneath it, craning your neck, realizing that belief was never part of the equation. Not evil, not supernatural, just humbling. They remind us that dominance is temporary, that intelligence doesn't guarantee control, that survival doesn't always belong to the loudest species. And that terrifies us more than monsters ever could, because monsters can be slain, they can be categorized, they can be defeated in stories. Giants, they don't play that role. Giants are reminders of hierarchy we don't like acknowledging. One where humans are clever, yes, but fragile, fast, but not enduring, innovative, but reckless. A species that expands aggressively and assumes the world will always make room for it. History says otherwise. Every civilization that believed itself permanent eventually learned it wasn't. The runes are still there, the warning signs were always there, and somewhere between the rise and fall, people convinced themselves that nothing bigger, older, or stronger was watching. Ancient cultures didn't make that mistake. They spoke about giants the way sailors spoke about storms, not as enemy, but as forces. You don't fight a storm, you respect it, you track it, you avoid it when you can, and when you can't, you pray you read the signs correctly. If you listen closely to modern encounters, the ones that don't scream for attention, you hear the same lesson repeating. People don't come back boasting. They don't come back wanting fame. They come back quieter, more careful, less certain about their place in the order of things. They stop lingering in wild places. They stop wandering off trail. They stop assuming solitude means safety. Because once you felt that scale, once you realized something could have ended you without effort and chose not to, gratitude mixes with fear in a way that never quite separates again. And maybe that restraint is the most important detail of all. Giants are not wiping us out. They are not reclaiming territory openly. They are not marching onto cities because that would be horrible. They are enduring, waiting the way mountains wait, the way glaciers wait, the way deserts wait. They don't need to rush. Human history moves fast. Human mistakes compound quickly. Human civilization burns hot and collapse under their own weight. And a species that learned to survive quietly wouldn't need to confront us at all. It would only need to stay out of reach and let time do what time always does. And occasionally, when boundaries are broken too aggressively, when silence is violated too carelessly, remind us that we are not the only ones who belong to this planet. Not with conquest, with presence, with a shape on a ridgeline that doesn't move when you notice it, with footsteps you feel through the ground before you hear them, with the unmistakable understanding that you are being allowed to leave. So where does that leave us? Not with answers, not with proof, not with comfort. It leaves us with responsibility. Responsibility to question why our ancestors feared certain places. Responsibility to listen when landscape resists being settled. Responsibility to understand that some stories survive not because they're entertaining, but because forgetting them gets people killed. I believe giants are flesh and bone, and some people believe there's something stranger. Maybe they're a convergence of memory, biology, and survival instinct we don't fully understand yet. Or maybe this is just a thought that tends to linger the longest. Maybe they're exactly what they've always been, the keeper of the scale. The reminder that this world was never built for our convenience, that we are guests here, not owners, that not everything hidden wants to be found. As we pave more roads, drill deeper, and light up the last dark places on the map, that reminder may become harder to ignore, not because giants are emerging, but because there's nowhere left for the silence to hide. So if you find yourself someday standing in a place that feels wrong for reasons you can't explain, if the forest goes still around you, if distance suddenly feels inadequate, don't panic, don't shout, don't chase understanding where it isn't welcome. Just remember what the old stories were really trying to teach. Some things don't need to announce themselves to be powerful. Some things survive by staying out of sight. And some roads, they were never meant to be traveled. And sometimes the safest thing you can do is turn around and leave the rest of the road unexplored. But this is Highway of the Hidden, and we're going to explore every road. And I'm your host, Polar Bear, and that's it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. If you had an encounter with a cryptid, paranormal, or you want to come on and talk conspiracies, or if you've seen a giant, you can reach me at my email, polarbearhoth@gmail.com, TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, or Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. Until next time, have a wonderful evening.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.